So, I'm just, no, I don't see any of the people whose questions have been posted are here. So we'll just, I'll take, I'll just go ahead and answer these questions that have been posted and then take questions from all of you. We'll just turn it into from a Q&A with prepared questions to an AMA. So Gunnar Gessner is the first question. And by the way, do you all have access to these questions? I assume you do. Anyway, I'll read the questions as I always do. Gunnar says, hi, Culadasa. So glad to hear you are well. Stage 7 here. Should I try and contain the bodily movements? The thumb twitching I was expecting, but my back and neck started bending in a snake-like movements. Also, my breath gets very accelerated. Ignoring it allows me to perceive the sensations of the breath very vividly, but it feels wrong to be swirling around. Attempting to remain still and pacing the breath works, but I seem to lose some concentration. Would love to hear from you. Thanks in advance. Gunnar, I wish you were here, but you are best off to use those movements as an opportunity to just practice allowing those things to happen and being aware that they are happening while not trying to do anything about them. And the awareness that your back and neck are starting to move and things like that can be accompanied by a tendency for attention to go to those movements and attention to go to thoughts like, should I try to control this? Should I try to slow my breathing? So on and so forth. So what you want to do, and let me preface saying what you want to do with why you want to do it. This goes to, just goes to the root of what are we trying to accomplish? What is the point of these mental exercises? We are trying to train attention and awareness so that each becomes more powerful and effective, and that they interact in more appropriate ways. The most appropriate way for attention to interact with awareness is to let awareness take care of everything except what is obvious, what obviously requires attention. Now, as you mentioned, if you were to try to do something about this, to pace your breath, to control these movements, things like that, you might feel more comfortable. But as you say, you seem to lose some concentration. Well, of course, what you're doing is you're responding to parts of your mind system that are not wanting to remain within the coalition of parts of your mind system that are holding the intention to keep attention focused on the sensations of the breath and to remain still and to simply be aware of whatever else is happening. And so you're undoing or you're contributing to the spontaneous undoing of the training that has led you up to this place. So stick to the program. You want attention to stay where you put it, and you want all those different subminds to agree to do that and cooperate with doing that. And you want to let awareness take care of everything else, which would include, okay, my body is going through all kinds of strange movements. Uh, it does tend to be distracting, uh, but it's not a problem. I don't really need to do anything about it. I can just let it happen and continue to practice. So that's the underlying reason for what I'm going to say, what I've already said about what you do, is you just be aware of this. Be aware of the tendency to attention sometimes to go there. Be aware of parts of your mind system that want you to do something about it. Just be aware of them, but keep your attention focused on the breath. This is what is going to happen is, sure, these different parts of your mind system want to do something different. They're used to being able to do something different. But if you gently, but firmly, or let's leave you out of it, and let's say if you just hold that aspiration that your mind will come to uh, behave in this way, then surely enough, given enough time, holding that intention, it will. It will. So please, yes, just allow those things to happen in awareness and allow yourself to be aware of all of the different responses of your different parts of your mind to what's going on. Nothing that happens is going to be a failure. It's going to be just what happens. So you see what happens, you understand what happens, uh, some sort of recognition. We could call it a kind of mundane insight into the behavior of the mind, which actually will lead ultimately to a super mundane insight. But it starts out as a mundane insight to, this is the way my mind behaves. This is the way my mind has always behaved. And if I want to have the kind of powerful mind that can penetrate appearances and see things as they really are, well, then I just need to stick with the training. And so whatever your mind does, that is the material from which a greater understanding will arise, that will allow to use the mind system model. It will allow the different subminds to understand more of what the collective is about and to be willing to join in and cooperate to achieve these higher goals. So I hope you find that helpful in answering your question. And if any of you here have any comments on what I've just said, I'd love to hear them.
If you know, one's body's moving in the way like slouching or something during a sit, which certainly seems to be becoming more pronounced in my sits recently. What, I mean, how much attention, I mean, surely not just sort of ignoring it or completely, what?
Slouching, in the case of slouching, you know, and that usually starts to happen. That usually happens much earlier than experience the kind of movements that Brenner is talking about here. And the best thing to do there is whenever you become aware that you're slouching, you just take that couple hundred milliseconds that's necessary to direct your attention to that fact, straighten yourself up, and continue on. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice that's always very interesting to me about these slouches or any other shifts in position is that when you correct for them, you realize they were not nearly as large as they appeared to be. You felt like you were really slumped over, but when you made the correction, you realized you only moved your head maybe 3/4 of an inch, right? So yes, correct for those. And it's it's being done intentionally. So it's completely consistent with the practice. It's not that some other part of your mind system is objecting to the slouch and jumping in and to being allowed to take over. It's that you're aware of it and you intentionally correct for it. It takes almost no time at all. And it's beneficial to the continuation of your practice. Because if you slouch, then you're going to increase the tension in your back muscles. And sooner or later, your back and your shoulders are going to start to ache. You're going to change the center of gravity depending on what kind of seat you're using. You're probably going to start to experience some discomfort in your legs or knees or something like that. So correcting for that slouch is a very worthwhile thing to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Now let's go to the next question is Francois. Hi, Culadasa. I hope you are keeping well. I am. Thank you. This is my first time asking a question. I live in Australia, so I cannot be on Zoom. 3 a.m. here. I hope you're sleeping well. Okay, I'm practicing in stage 3-4. I wonder if you could talk about the feelings of awareness. My understanding is that awareness is a subconscious process that doesn't feel like it is me, like attention does. At least for spontaneous awareness, like the aha moment after forgetting, I don't feel like I have done anything. Similarly, I often get an aha moment for a subtle to gross distraction while I'm still focusing on the breath, which I understand is continuous introspective awareness. Yes, it is. And I get the feeling that someone else has brought to my attention that there was a distraction present. However, I also had a few episodes of what I think was metacognitive introspective awareness. And that one did feel like I was both the one watching the breath and the one watching the breath. Was that then not metacognitive introspective awareness? Or is that the feelings around awareness, or is it that feelings around awareness change as the practice progresses? Well, let's go back to the beginning here. My understanding is that awareness is a subconscious process. No, awareness is the essence of consciousness. Attention is a function that occurs within the field of conscious awareness. It's something that has been superadded. Evolutionarily, the parts of your brain that give rise to the experience of attention are much more recent in their development than the parts of your brain that are responsible for consciousness as per se in the form of awareness. So it's not a subconscious process, but the contents of your consciousness all arise from the subconscious. So it's not that you're really wrong in what you said, just maybe how you worded it or how you're conceptualizing it. Yes, obviously, with a spontaneous aha moment, something, an unconscious process, has now projected into consciousness the fact that, hey, I'm not doing what I was intending to do. Yes, that came from somewhere else. It feels like somebody else did it. And of course, the same thing, you can have a similar experience of suddenly becoming conscious. Let me say, suddenly becoming aware that there is a gross distraction or something like this happening, the forgetting, mind wandering, gross distraction. A subtle distraction is becoming gross distraction. This is often, and it's a good sign in your practice that you're that you recognize this. This is something that has arisen out of your subconscious into your conscious mind. Practicing at stages 3, 4, you may not yet have read the 5th interlude, but it's clearly time for you to do that. And the whole chapter kind of builds up towards the end to making the point that consciousness doesn't do anything. It's a place that information arrives from different parts of the unconscious mind system, and by which other parts of the unconscious mind system have access to this information. And that's exactly what you're experiencing. And it sounds as though that you've developed sufficient awareness to recognize what's actually happening, that it's this knowledge, this information, this recognition, whether it's of mind wandering, forgetting, gross distraction, subtle distraction, strengthening, dullness, whatever it is, this is not something that is being done by consciousness, but rather it is something that arrives in consciousness, in awareness. Now, once it arrives in awareness, you can pay attention to it and then correct for it. But after a while, you don't need to pay attention to it. You become aware of it and correct for it. And then eventually what happens is, as soon as it arises in awareness, it gets automatically corrected for. And what your conscious experience is of, oh, a distraction began to become strong and my mind corrected for it. And there's no sense of, attention wasn't involved, and there's no sense of an agent at all. It just happened by itself. Ultimately, there isn't even the conscious experience of a distraction arising, because that has already been taken care of as an unconscious experience. I'm talking now about the point where this has become effortless, and both dullness and distraction are corrected for effortlessly. Okay, so yes, you similarly, I often get an aha moment for a subtle distraction, which I understand is continuous introspective awareness. Yes, that is exactly right. Get the feeling that someone else has brought to my attention. Someone else or something else, the rest of your unconscious mind system has brought to awareness, which you'll eventually discover isn't yours anyway, because there's no you for it to belong to. But yes, something else, i.e. the unconscious mind, has brought to awareness that there is a distraction present. You've also had some episodes of basically watching the mind watch the breath, and that is exactly the description that I give for what it feels like to have metacognitive introspective awareness. And just as with what I described for what happens with this information from the unconscious mind becoming consciously aware of it, this comes to be more and more the norm. In other words, this state of being aware of awareness and attention and what is happening in the mind as a whole begins to become the normal state of functioning of your mind, which allows this. Now awareness is so much more powerful, and likewise part of its power comes from the fact that attention isn't constantly jumping on objects of awareness and moving around, creating this sort of disruption in the mind. If you ever look at Patanjali's Yoga Suttas. That's what he begins with, the vrittis, or the vibrations that disturb the quiet of the mind. That doesn't mean the mind is contentless, but it means that attention is not jumping around, creating disturbances, disturbing the waters, so that that metacognitive experience of seeing clearly what is happening in the mind becomes obscured. Yes, you've got it. You're doing great. Yes. So carry on. And once again, anyone have any comments on what I've just said? Hi.
Sorry, I was eating lunch because I just finished teaching a beginner class. And I love teaching your method to the beginners. It's so great.
Good for you. Wonderful. And I'm glad you love it. Yeah. Wonderful to see you. Yeah. Anybody have any comments, questions, anything like that about what I just said? All right. Then I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Anchor Delight. What a lovely name. Greetings, Culadasa. I'm practicing at stage 2-3, I think, and have noticed it's easier for me to focus and concentrate when doing metta practice as opposed to anapana. What are the ramifications of focusing more on metta and less on the breath? Oh my goodness, I really wish you were here, because I'd like to ask you some questions. So I can only address this question in a very general way. Often doing metta is doing more metta and less following of the breath, less anapana, is the best thing that you can do. But that depends on what's happening in your mind and why you're choosing to make that shift. If there is some agitation, if there are emotions, if there are problems in your life, the reasons why this would be valuable, I could just go on and on about what they are. There are reasons why it would be valuable and appropriate, but only to achieve specific purposes and limited to doing that. Now, it is taught by one of the most well-known, in one of the most well-known commentaries, the Visuddhimagga, that you can achieve a very high level of concentration, including jhanas, using, there I went and used the word that I never liked, concentration. But that's yeah, anyway. You can achieve a very high level of attentional stability using the using metta practice, using all of the Brahma Viharas. But nevertheless, I'd like you to think in terms of the overall practice and purpose that this is about, and why in the very beginning I pointed out that there were very real advantages to using the sensations of the breath as a meditation object. You want to, and you're hopefully listening to the recording of this, and you'll have heard what I said earlier, but what you want to achieve is that very powerful, well-trained attention and that very powerful metacognitive awareness that are going to be working together in the most appropriate way. And using the breath sensations to anchor your attention while you do this. In my experience, and my experience in teaching, my experience in teaching people that have practiced in many other ways with different meditation objects, and allowing for, there's always the possibility that, I can't go back and do it over again in other ways, but there may be exceptions to this. But I have found that it is the most reliable way and the quickest way to achieve those goals in terms of training your mind, which are going to lead you to the place where you can experience insight and awakening. So doing metta practice rather than anapana does have its place, and it's very important. It plays an extremely important role. I'll go so far as to say it would be a mistake for anyone to do only breath practice and neglect metta practice. That would be a very serious mistake. However, there are some not so good reasons for choosing to do metta practice. These include the fact that initially the stabilizing your attention can be challenging, and that challenge can produce a sense of discomfort and dissatisfaction and frustration and so on and so forth. Not can, but will. And not just can and will, but really should, because it gives you the opportunity to work with those. And working with those is important. And avoiding them by going to something that you may find easier and more pleasant is not a good thing to do. Admittedly, the joy of watching your breath practice is primarily in succeeding at it and in the fascination of learning more about your mind and how it works and how it behaves. Whereas doing the metta practice produces a different kind of pleasure and happiness. And while that is extremely good in and of itself, if what you're doing is you're choosing what produces the kind of pleasure and satisfaction that's most appealing to you, then that's not a good idea. That's not a good reason. It doesn't mean you shouldn't still do the metta practice, but you should continue to make your primary practice be the breath focus. As I say, there's so much, I could probably get to the root of why you asked this question, and I'm going to give you a much more highly specific answer if you were here with us today, but you're not. So this is about as far as I can go, just speaking in general about the roles of metta and anapana, respectively. But to all of you, take this little discussion as a reminder that if you've been neglecting to do metta as a part of your regular practice, at least periodically during the week, doing a metta session or doing a short metta session as a part of your daily practice or in some form or another, then please do that. And if you're somebody that's finding, oh, this breath practice is just unsatisfying and the metta is so much nicer, I think I'll just do that, then please recognize the mistake that you're making. You're trying to, that's, if you were working out in a gym and you found that lifting the weights was just too much trouble and you thought you'd just spend your whole gym session say doing the walking machine or something like that, it's going to produce different effects. And you probably had a desire to either increase your strength or your physical attractiveness or something else through working with weights, and the walking machine is not going to do that. So anyway, I look forward maybe sometime in the future to you being present. Once again, opportunity for anyone else to comment if they wish.
Could I add to that a bit?
Please.
Just one thought, again, depending if somebody is liking metta but still wanting to work with improving concentration skills, is that associated with metta, there are all sorts of things that could become meditation objects.
Yes.
Right? So there are feelings in the body that are associated with the emotions around metta. There may be images that you're visualizing that are associated with the metta. You're visualizing someone you want to do metta for. You're visualizing some images that helps you make those, or that images are coming. There's sounds. You may be repeating set phrases or wishes for someone. All of those are possible meditation objects. And so you can work with attention in the same way you would work with the breath, to focus attention on those. Take that as your meditation object. That way you can build some of those concentration skills, some of those attentional skills, as well as do a practice that may be either a supplement or may be better for you. There are people that have difficulty physiologically and otherwise in working with the breath. And so for those people, additional or alternative meditation objects are really useful. And another source for variations like this, Shinzen Young talks a lot about nurture positive and feel good and other techniques where, again, he's talking about metta-like or Brahma-Vihara-like objects as meditation objects.
Thank you. Yes, that is very true. And that is one of the things that I point out in the first chapter, or well, the first stage, is that just about anything can be, you can accomplish these goals with just about anything. And and what I was addressing before has to do with your motivation. If you intend to achieve, if you intend to progress through the same stages of developing powerful, stable attention and powerful and ultimately introspective awareness, you can use metta to do that as well as anything. You're absolutely right. Yes, just be very clear on your motivations, your reasons, and understand where you're trying to get to and why you're trying to get there. That's the biggest obstacle, I think, for most people in these earlier stages where they're trying to decide, well, what's the meditation object that works for me, is that they're often not clear on what's really motivating their desire to shift. And the biggest complication is they don't really understand the connection between the training they're doing in these earlier stages and the abilities that they lead to that will eventually make insight and awakening virtually inevitable. So if you know those things, if you understand those things, then you can use metta, then you can use anything. You can probably use welding as an object, a meditation object. I wouldn't want to have a cessation moment with a welding torch in my hand, but anyway, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that greatly. That was very good. Great addition. All right, as always. We have one last posted question, and then we'll turn this into an AMA. Shantanu, I wanted to understand your take on balancing between desire and detachment. I have interest in computer science and mathematics, but I find that spending more hours studying causes thoughts of problem solving to arise during meditation. On the other hand, when I do long periods of meditation on a routine basis, my motivation to study starts to fade away. Is there something I can do to pursue both the activities in a more balanced way? Well, yes, there certainly is. And let's just talk about that. You have an interest in computer science and mathematics, but I find that spending more hours studying causes thoughts of problem solving to arise during meditation. This is very, very normal. Yes. And let's talk about desire in this. There are many different forms that desire can take. And desire can definitely be responsible for these things arising in your meditation. And they can be responsible for you preferring to continue to study or to work on some project, so on and so forth, rather than meditate. I know I can just talk about what this feels like. I love learning things. I love learning new things. If I'm in a process of study and there is this burgeoning understanding taking place, then it's very easy for there to arise the wish to continue to do that other than something else, because it's very satisfying, it's very enjoyable. Now, there could be other reasons too. You don't say exactly why you're studying these things, but I highly suspect you may be a university student. You could be a student that is doing well in a course, and you've been acing your exams and papers and projects, and your desire comes from the satisfaction that it gives you to do that. And so you want to do the studying because you want that hit that comes when you get your paper back, or you get your exam results back and you've aced it again. It can come from fear that, oh, I've missed several lectures. I haven't been keeping up with the reading. I've got to study because otherwise, I might fail the course. I mean, it can come from anything, all kinds of things. All right. And these aren't that different from the kinds of things that intrude on meditation. If you're having problems in your life, if there's difficult situations you're dealing with, financial, emotional, relational, the whole list, these can become distractions because that same desire factor, craving factor is there. These needs to be dealt with. I need to do something about these, even if there's nothing you can do about them. That doesn't keep the feeling from coming there. And of course, yes, you sit down and meditate. As soon as your mind starts to get quiet, then these parts of your mind system that are holding these concerns and driven by these desires, they're going to want to take advantage of this time, and they're going to bring these things into your consciousness. So it's normal. Now, what do you do about it? You watch it. You observe it. You acknowledge it. You don't fight against it. You see, you just, this is what my mind does. The more you watch it, the more clearly you understand it. Now, when I say watch it, of course, there's two ways that you can watch it. Now, one is that you can examine these things with your attention. But in order to examine anything with attention, you had to become aware of it first. So if you approach the problem of the desire to think about a problem, a mathematical theorem that you're beginning to understand, or a mathematical problem that you find that you want to find the solution to, something like that that's coming up, you can direct your attention not to the problem itself, but to the fact of this urge, this impulse, this desire, this compulsion that is arising. Now, where awareness is really valuable in this is awareness just sees this as, it's a desire, right? Attention is going to want to take it apart and examine it and investigate it. And there is, to a limited degree, some value in there, but it's pretty limited. So it's okay if it happens, but don't let it keep happening. Really, attention will have done everything it can about understanding the problem in a very short period of time. What's really important is getting to that place where you can be aware of these things arising, and what predominates in terms of directing your behavior is oh yeah, it's that desire, it's that craving, and this is the reason for it. And yeah, of course it's going to come up, and okay, so it comes up, and oh yeah, well, so I'll redirect my attention, or I when this arises, and I'll be aware of it arising, and gradually you'll get better at this, and you won't be distracted by as much, and so on and so forth. So that's what you do about it, is that you just go ahead and know it, accept it, acknowledge it. But that doesn't mean dwelling on it with attention, except to the limited degree that's valuable. But keep in mind that attentional analysis of the phenomenon is going to have a limited value, and you'll exhaust that fairly quickly. So the main thing is just allowing this much less craving-prone part of your consciousness, awareness, to just see this for what it is, accept it for what it is, acknowledge that it's going to be there, and give it a chance to resolve itself and go away. Now, the other part of this that you were saying is that on the other hand, when I do long periods of meditation on a routine basis, my motivation to study starts to fade away. Is there something I can do to pursue this in a more balanced way? Yes, there is. Not that different, but different nevertheless. And this is to what you're always after here is to recognize what's happening in your mind and why it's happening in your mind. So there is obviously some kind of preference. What you're saying is that there is developing a preference for meditation over study and analytical processes. Well, it's really the mirror image of what we talked about before. And the way to deal with that, of course, is if it is appropriate to be studying, then just go ahead and examine this, be with it in awareness that, oh yes, I would rather sit and meditate. I would rather enter into that peaceful meditative state where my analytical mind isn't doing all this energy consuming work of of studying. In other words, you've got a different set of desires and preferences that is beginning to eclipse that other set of desires and preferences. And so you can actually treat it the same way, because it is essentially just the mirror image of what we've already discussed. You can also, in both of these cases, there's nothing wrong. Like there's, let me see how to put this into words. I don't think in words, so I have to struggle a little bit here. Okay. Really what I want to address here is the difference between something being pleasant, giving you satisfaction, and perhaps eliciting a preference, and the sort of compulsion that we would describe as desire or craving. And it is, the one is something that is normal and is always going to be with you, and the other is something that eventually you want to overcome completely. But now, in these particular two situations, meditation versus study, you want to make use of the one and avoid the other. Your study does give you satisfaction and enjoyment. Make use of that. You make use of that judiciously. It can become compulsive in the form of craving and interfere with your meditation. But this latter problem you're describing is the case where instead the craving is associated with the meditation. So you want to elicit the pleasure, the joy, the satisfaction that comes from the learning, the studying, the achieving, so on and so forth. That will give you the appropriate motivation to do what you need to do when you need to do it. And likewise, you can do the same thing with the meditation. When you find yourself being distracted and wanting to get back to work on that problem you had, look for the joy in your meditation, look for the satisfaction there. So this is, when I think of it in the moment right now, I realize that these kinds of experiences that happen early on in the practice are in themselves invaluable learning experiences. To learn that actual difference between the fact that there will always be a preference for whatever it is that has most recently been a source of pleasure. That's always going to be there. And that is not the same, that preference is not the same as the compulsion to pursue or cling to that. It's not the same as craving. And this is something that people can get quite far along without being able to understand the difference between these two. So it just occurs to me now, I'd probably include this in part of my instruction and teacher training classes, and maybe in the next edition as at least a end note in the next edition of the Mind Illuminated, to point out that this too is an opportunity that comes up early on in the process to learn to distinguish between what is moving you in a positive direction and how to use these things that are naturally a part of you, that are part of human nature in a positive way, to distinguish between those and the ones that move you in the wrong direction and that are ultimately going to be problematic to you and causes of suffering for you. So it's a great opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity. Yes, think of those, think of these as an opportunity to learn and understand that distinction more deeply. In the mind illuminated, I say, look for the joy. Look for the joy, because that's going to help you to become more successful in your meditation. What I'm doing now is just maybe explaining why looking for the joy isn't an example of cultivating craving, because it's not. And the distinction between those. And something that, especially as a layperson in the world, this is going to become more and more important to you as you follow this path and as you succeed in it. So I hope that gives you something to work with, Shantanu, and would love to hear more from you in the future. And if anyone would like to add to, comment on, ask questions about what I've just said, great, Bill, go for
it. Well, there's just a few things that, a few different ways of looking at this. One of the things, there's so much emphasis on us or describing things that arise as distractions and feeling negative about getting distracted. Whereas the observation that when one sees or is aware that one is distracted, that's exactly the kind of metacognitive awareness that one is constantly trying to develop, to catch oneself in absent-minded, habitual thought patterns.
Right.
So I mean, that is, sort of the primary skill that we're really trying to work with, is to develop that catching it. The second thing is that often, and for me, it's easier to distinguish or look at distractions wherever they arise and look at them as a process, as opposed to trying to be aware of the content of the process. Mm-hmm. So just seeing them as processes, for me, helps disidentify with those.
Yes. Being aware of them helps to remove that selfing, that self-identification with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's really appreciate your adding that, Bill. It's really true. And a distraction is only a distraction, or any particular thing is only a distraction within a particular context, and it's defined as a distraction only in that context. If you are in a completely safe location and you are meditating and your intention is to keep your attention focused on the sensations of the breath, then by definition in that context, anything else that competes for your attention is a distraction, but only by virtue of the fact that it's competing with your intention to pay attention to your meditation object, right? If there are other things that could occur that, an armed man walks into your meditation room, well, that's not a distraction. You're doing walking meditation and there's a tree about to fall on you. That is not a distraction. Yeah. So even the term distraction, we have to be careful that we realize that it's defined according to the context. And the whole function of awareness is, yes, it's to know what's going on. It's to have a much larger grasp of the bigger picture that you're a part of in the moment. And of yourself as an interactive part of that, so that, you know, rather than you're aware of everything around you, but what's going on in your own mind in response to it is not seen clearly. You're looking for an awareness that sees the whole picture, and what's happening in your mind is a very big part of the whole picture. So those are not distractions. They're only distractions contextually, depending on the circumstances, what you're trying to do. Excellent point. You're muted, Bill, if you had more to say.
I was curious. I've been reading this book by Jan Fraser, the freedom of being with what is, and now it's interesting that she talks of attentional behavior, you've talked of attention in terms of it being the situation where we evaluate our relationship to the object that we're attending to. We're thinking of, is it good for us, bad for us? How do we have our relationship? Versus peripheral awareness, which is not analyzing, but just being aware of what's arising. She talks about that evaluating part of attention as being the ego attention. And then the other awareness, she's starting to, I almost get the idea that she's identifying this peripheral awareness as being like the witness. And I was curious, what were your thoughts about the comparison or contrast between the witness and peripheral awareness?
Well, there's, what she's saying is ultimately legitimate, but it seems dangerously prone to misinterpretation. The witness, to experience the witness, that's sort of to achieve the ultimate state of metacognitive introspective awareness. There there is just the witnessing of what's taking place, and that is metacognitive awareness in its most refined degree. Where it can be confusing is that where you try to apply that idea of the witness to, in first of all, in the absence of an understanding of clear difference between attention and peripheral awareness, and secondly, where these abilities haven't been developed to the extent that this practice is intended to develop them, then it can become a source of confusion, right? There can be, attention is, in a very fundamental way, I'm sure you know this, as you observe your mind more closely, certain things become more and more obvious. One of which is that the attentional function is very self-centered, or this body-mind centered, and that's why it developed. But we can enter into states where we're using this analytical faculty where that does not seem to be present. Solving a problem, uh, engaging in some creative activity, building a better mousetrap, figuring out how a watch works by taking it apart and things like that. The egocentric aspect of attention when performing those kinds of analytical functions seems to drop into the background, but it is still there. It is still there. Anything, you know, this attention has developed and has been taken such great advantage of by Homo sapiens especially, because it has enormous survival value. It has enormous value for, you know, the ability to to use and to make tools. You know, that's one of the most fundamental advantages that our species has over others, and with such sophistication that we can build both supercomputers and hydrogen bombs, things like that. It does have a built-in advantage. Sorry, I hope I'm not creating background noise. I'll stop doing that. And so it is, you know, we're predisposed to perform these kinds of analytical and reductive come synthetic activities that allow us to discover how things work and invent new things and so on and so forth, because it is of value to this body-mind. So that egocentric function is still a part of it. The advantage of awareness is that its primary function is relational, and this body and mind are a part of a whole and is in relation to the other things that constitute that awareness. And attention serves an extremely valuable purpose with regards to awareness. Because awareness actually constitutes your model of reality. And much, from a human perspective, certainly, much of our model of reality is the product of the analytical processes that we have engaged in using attention. It has brought about a tremendous refinement of our model of reality. And it allows us to go far beyond the limitations of our senses. So I think I maybe gotten quite a bit away from your original question there, but, or your original statement. But to go back to it, you're right, she's right in recognizing that this experience of witnessing, that is a function of peripheral awareness. It informs attention, and attention informs peripheral awareness. And so the correctness of what she's saying is indisputable, but as I said, can easily lead to misinterpretations if you don't clearly enough understand what's going on in your mind. If you don't clearly enough understand the difference between these two functions of the mind.
I guess one of the ways in which she talks about peripheral awareness here is in terms of not resisting reality.
Mhm.
Whatever reality is, it's just accepting everything and anything that comes up.
That's right. Once attention has been brought, has become a tool under the direction of awareness, and once one's conscious experience becomes awareness dominated, that's exactly where a place you arrive at. This is the way it is. Such it is, and no other. That's suchness, acceptance. That just this is the way it is. That's when attention jumps in and says, yes, but it could be different. But awareness is about, this is the way it is. This is the way it's happening. This is what's unfolding. Yep. These are the relationships between things, and this is how they're affecting each other, and this is how they're changing. Yeah. So I haven't heard of this person before, but I kind of like her thinking.
When you're done with that question, Bill, I'd like to just say something about Jan, if that's okay. Yeah, I know her. She was a Western Mass person, and she practiced with Guru Mai Chidvisalananda through Kashmir Shaivism. And her two main practices were devotional practice and chanting, and mindfulness. Just being aware of everything all the time, everything she was doing, what was happening, and she woke up. And it's interesting because when she expresses herself in her writings, it can sound very Buddhist, but it doesn't have she doesn't know anything about neuroscience, and she hasn't figured out the attention awareness thing, the way you have. And so the languaging can get a little confusing, just as Bill was noticing, although she's very clear. Which brings me to my question. So because the neuroscientists know that there are two different parts of the brain and that attention and awareness are not the same. And yet in the Theravadin tradition, people may have heard it or read about it or, read your book, but it's not really working its way into meditation practice very much, as far as I can tell. At least in, the kind of American Insight Meditation Society, Spirit Rock world. Little bits of it, but it seems so important. And I'm just kind of wondering if, there are any more conferences or conversations or anything where people are trying to address this at all that you know of?
Well, what I'm aware of, and I think this is probably how it's going to make its way into these other traditions that have never made this distinction, because that seems the trend. There seems to be a trend, very strong trend in Western Buddhism, where these institutions like the ones you mentioned are basically transplants from Asia, from completely different cultural and historical backgrounds. In Western Buddhism, there is this inevitable wish to understand, and our culture understands through scientific examination. The people who are doing the most to work with, to recognize, to make use of this distinction are people working in the areas of cognitive science. And the Cochise people are taking a lot of interest in meditation, and the meditation people are taking a lot of interest in Cochise. So I think that's probably going to be the main gateway into this. I know that this idea of attention and awareness as two different faculties has received some recognition, has made its way into some of the teachings of some of the teachers in the centers and institutions you mentioned. And that all happened before the events of last summer. And so I'm afraid that process has been interrupted. And it won't be until I get around to making my response to those things that were said at that time and regain some some legitimacy in the minds of other meditation teachers and meditation centers, that process will resume. I think too many meditators who've tried TMI have discovered how useful it is. Although there may be this temporary thing that certainly hope it's temporary. I'm going to do my best to make it temporary. But there's this temporary thing where people are turning away from TMI or mistrustful of TMI because what's been said about me. That process has maybe been truncated over the last few months. But it was becoming more and more a part of what different teachers were talking about in their Dharma talks and their retreats and things like that. And I hope that day will come back. I hope it won't be long.
That's yeah, and I know you're working on some other books too, which should help this along. I would guess too. Is that right? Or?
Oh yes, you're right about that. Yes, right, I am.
Yeah, and my guess is that there are, you're not the only one that has been talking about this. There must be other cognitive scientists that teach meditation that can kind of help along these lines also.
Yes, there are. And I'm very, very proud to say some of them are even students of mine. So. And others that aren't students of mine are friends of mine. So that's good too. Yeah.
I have to take Jan a copy of your book. She doesn't read that much anymore because she doesn't need to, but sometimes she will. So I'll take her copy of your book and see if she can work on her languaging a little.
Sure.
For her next writing.
Great. Sounds wonderful. Yeah.
I've had this general experience that so many of these methods, whether they're different Buddhist methods or different Advaita methods or methods that are even related to dealing with trauma therapy or Feldenkrais, they all use different vocabularies, but they're all talking about the same processes. And so it's sort of interesting. It seems like people have attractions to different kinds of metaphors, that sort of different kinds of metaphorical descriptions of what's going on. They're all being incomplete. They're all being stories and all having that universal property of emptiness. But they all point to similar things. So it becomes like a process of trying to internally translate.
Yes.
All these different things. Or at least just trying to maintain an awareness of how they're all pointing or something.
Yes, absolutely. Because in every tradition, it may seem quite unrecognizable, but in every tradition, you find that people are talking about the same things, but in language that is so different that it's just it's a huge challenge to recognize it wow, these things that sound so different, they're really saying the same thing. But of course, that is because there is some sort of ultimate truth, and we'll never be able to grasp it, and we'll never know it directly. But no matter what we do, and no matter how we do it, everything from Western science to every form of spiritual practice, Buddhism, Christianity, anything, what we're all doing is we're trying to learn through inference and induction things about this ultimate truth. And this, by virtue of its ultimaticity, it's the same truth. So no matter what the method is that we're talking about, and no matter what the vocabulary it is that we've chosen to describe it in, as our understanding develops, we're talking about the same thing ultimately. And distinguishing between attention and awareness, that's just another conceptual model. That's just another story to help us see and understand. It has some advantages, but you know, somebody may come along with something next year that works even better, and I'll adopt it. Who knows?
Hi, Culadasa. Would you mind saying a little bit more about the differences between discerning preference and craving, and like you brought up in the question before, and just maybe what your experience is around being able to observe craving without moving into it, and what that might entail, different ways of maybe doing that?
Okay, so would you like me to start by expanding on pleasant, unpleasant, and the preference that will always exist with regard to those two, and the compulsion that is craving? All right.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Well, the Vedas of pleasant and unpleasant, both physical and mental, will always be with us. They are fundamental. They are actually definitive of sentience itself. They are the first qualia to arise in the evolution of nervous systems that that achieves the definition of sentience, pleasant and unpleasant. And selection has, for each species, selected that what will be pleasant will be preferred. That's, in a sense, that's the essence of pleasantness. It's a feeling that even if you didn't have the cognitive capacity to generate something called preference, it's a feeling which would cause your behavior to manifest in a particular way. The experience of pleasantness in the most primitive sentient being causes that organism to behave positively in response to pleasantness, and to take a different, have a different reaction to the experience of unpleasantness. But out of that comes, at a higher development of higher cognitive development, a preference. That's exactly the same thing. It's just now been extended to a little bit more sophisticated level, perceptual level. Okay, so we will always have a preference for what is pleasant over what is unpleasant. It's always going to be part of us. It's always going to be there. Whether we choose the pleasant or the unpleasant. And this is the thing, we can, as with the, especially with the degree of development of the human nervous system and mind, we can choose the unpleasant over the pleasant, or we can walk away from the pleasant for good reasons, because we're capable of distinguishing those kinds of good reasons, right? Yeah. Now, craving is a compulsion. Now, I've just said we have the capacity to walk away from the pleasant or even to embrace the unpleasant because we have some kind of understanding, some other cognitive process that allows us to recognize the value in walking away from the pleasant or embracing the unpleasant, right? Now, craving is a compulsion, and it's different. One of its differences is that it completely overrides that ability that we have to walk away from the pleasant or to embrace the unpleasant, which are based on what we might consider more rational cognitive faculties that would cause us to do that. It is a compulsion, and it is completely different than preference. There have been identified 3 distinct circuits in the brain. One, which when activated produces the experience of pleasantness. Another, which when activated produces the experience of unpleasantness. And a third, distinct from these 2, that produces what the authors of the paper I read call wanting, but I mean, it's craving. It's craving. Now, there's an interaction between these. And what this wanting circuit does, or this craving circuit does, is it reinforces the tendency to move towards the pleasant and away from the unpleasant. It's also subject to modification. It can function independently of these 2. It can be primed and conditioned by the circuits for pleasant and unpleasant, but they are independent. They're completely independent. And one example that occurred to me recently that makes that clear, well, I know I had spoken to recovered heroin addicts who they experience that craving, and it has nothing to do with pleasant, because when they think of beginning to use again, the only thought that comes to their mind is how horrible it is that constantly chasing that need, the fear of the sickness coming on, and all of these other things, the mess it's made of their lives, the relationships and everything like that. But then a much more common example came to my mind, the cigarette smoker. The craving to have a cigarette. Talk to a smoker. If you've ever been a smoker, you know what I'm talking about. The craving can be there and be completely unconnected disconnected from any kind of pleasure. As a matter of fact, it can be directly associated with the experience of unpleasantness. But I have this craving to do this unpleasant thing, but the craving is just there. It's a compulsion. And we look at the neurology of it, and that makes sense. We have a circuit that has, it's activated now, not by the pleasure that comes from smoking a cigarette, but it's independently, there was a process that led to it being this way, of course. But once it is this way, it is this way. And it's going to, when it's activated, that compulsion is going to be there. Another way to understand this, I think, is to look at the word that the Buddha used to discuss craving, tana, and tana means thirst. And so I like to ask people, when was the last time you experienced true thirst? And, the next question is, and how often does that happen? And then the next question after that, you'll see one question leads to the other, is, well, why don't you experience thirst more often? And the answer is that when our mouth gets dry, we have a preference to have a drink of water. It's not a compulsion. If we, in the process of going to get a drink of water, we encountered something that was more important to deal with, we drop that, we take care of the more important thing. A lot of the times, it's just we formed habits. We have tea at certain times, or we get used to, before I sit down to give one of these talks, I know my mouth is going to get dry. So I have a cup of water or a glass of water or a cup of tea next to me. Not because of craving. And, no, it's just, it's something I've learned to do. And I do automatically. Because I do that automatically, when's the last time I experienced thirst? The last time I can remember was last spring, cleaning the patio of the little place where I'm living here in Tucson. And it's hot in spring here in Tucson. And I got dehydrated and I felt thirst. I felt that physiological compulsion that, wow, okay, I got to go in, I got to get myself a big glass of water and I got to just sit down and drink it. And then I got to have, and this part went beyond that, and I'm smart enough to know that if I'm starting to get dehydrated, that I'd better drink 2 glasses of water. Otherwise, I'm going to still be dehydrated. All right. Yeah. That's the last time I remember experiencing thirst. And this can help us really understand craving. We can respond in very appropriate ways to pleasant and unpleasant without there being craving present. We don't need, in other words, we don't need to only drink when we experience thirst. Thirst is not necessary. Many people who I ask this question to can't even remember the last time they experienced thirst. Or at first they will mistake, they'll say, well, it was just, I had an urge to go have a cup of tea this morning. I mean, and I said, yeah, but would you describe that as craving? Was there a compulsion in there? No, it's just, there arose in me this feeling. Well, this is what that wanting circuit is originally designed to do. That's why it exists. That's why links were formed between the wanting circuit and the pleasure circuit and the unpleasant circuit. It was just exactly so that you would have an urge to go have a cup of tea, and it wouldn't manifest as a compulsion. It would just be an urge, a preference that, I think I'll have a cup of tea. And that's why, and like I say, this is what someone said to me, and it helped her to understand the distinction that I was talking about here. And there are people who can't remember the last time they experienced thirst because it's been a very long time. So once you understand this, the mystery of how you could live without craving is solved. I used to have people in my classes I'd be teaching, and they'd say, but why would I even want to get out of bed in the morning if I didn't have craving? Why would I ever do anything if it wasn't for craving? Well, if you understood craving as the way I've just explained it, then you would see there are all kinds of other reasons for you to get out of bed in the morning other than craving. Craving is not necessary. That kind of thirst, the actual thirst for water, is not necessary. It's tremendously useful. When I experience that physiological compulsion, it is the physiological, emotional, lower brain correlate to the craving somebody might have for money or sensual pleasures or for fame or praise or you name it, any of the worldly dharmas, or to avoid loss or to avoid pain or things like that. Yes. Yes, Bill.
I was curious, were these three circuits, were they distinguished by their neurotransmitters as well?
I would guess the answer would have to be yes, but I can't say that for sure. On the other hand, just as I say that, I hadn't thought of that question before, and I don't recall whether it was mentioned in the paper. Although I have to go back and look at the paper. It's been a while since I read it, because that would most likely be one of the ways that they had identified those circuits. On the other hand, there must be an overlap between those, because there are three neurotransmitters in particular that we know have a tremendous amount to do with the states of pleasantness and unpleasantness and craving. And those are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. And so without going back to the study and seeing how they differentiated between them and what they distinguish, my guess, my speculation off the top of my head is that all three circuits probably make some use of all three transmitters, but probably in different proportions in different ways.
Hi, Culadasa. I have a question if we still have some time left.
Well, we're over time anyway, so let's go over time.
Oh, are we? Okay. Well, I just thought you mentioned something earlier that I thought was interesting and perhaps you could expand on, and that is the importance of metta in our practice. Now, it is given in the book, and perhaps you could say more about why you feel it's such a fundamental and critical practice to engage in. And I might just have a second part to that question, which is my experience of metta has not been very fulfilling, or I've developed something of an aversion to it, because I find it like I'm trying to create feelings that aren't there, which I think you did mention in the book. Sort of, it feels artificial to me. Perhaps you could talk about that as well, if
Yeah.
there's time. Thank you.
Yes. What we are doing with metta practice, with the Brahma Vihara practices, we are cultivating mental states. Now, I find it helpful to use the word state and to use the word state as it is used in systems theory, and to use the word mental in reference to the human brain mind as an extremely complex, dynamic, open system that is capable of many different states and that is self-organizing, so that it can increase the system is capable of increasing the likelihood of certain states, of the system entering into certain states. And it can make it easier for the system to find its way to those states over time. It's self-organizing. Metta practice and Brahmavihara practices in general, the Lojong practices in the Tibetan system, all of these things, what they are doing is they're training the mind to be able to enter particular states and to make those states more stable, to make them stronger. As if you're familiar with the term strange attractor, which I'm sure you are, it makes these states more powerful as an attractor. And so when the system is in another state, it will be more readily drawn to this state, and this state will be more stable. It will be, to use often when talking about states and dynamic systems, use sort of a planar analogy, and you see each state is sort of a well, and how deep the well is corresponds to how stable the state is, and the plane has grooves in it that lead from state to state to interconnect these different states. So what we're really doing in these practices is we're deepening the well corresponding to the state of to the states that I combine together with the term loving kindness, and it's deepening the channels that lead to those states. So it's making them more stable and making them more easily accessible. Now, to do this in the beginning, the state of the first of the states is that of being is that of being free from suffering, of not needing anything, not being in a state of discomfort. In other words, a state of contentment. Now that is a state that you've experienced, and you can use your recollection of that experience to induce that state. Another aspect of loving kindness is the state of being free from ill will, free from animosity, anger, so on and so forth, of being at peace, essentially. That's what it feels like to be at peace. As a matter of fact, neither having some discomfort that you feel compelled to remedy, nor having some dislike that you want to act upon, some ill will that, and there's a lot of similarity between these two. And the cultivation of one reinforces the cultivation of the other. But at the same time, we can regard them as states which, in our planar analogy, they're dips in the surface that are very close together. And if they both deepen enough, they'll end up being a single dip, right? There may be a little hump at the bottom that can, so that it could be a little bit more on the side of the peace state, or a little bit more on the side of the contentment state, but it's not really relevant. Likewise for the feeling of love for others, and likewise for the feeling of happiness. So yes, how do we get there? It does feel contrived, but you use your imagination, you use your memory, you use whatever tools you have at your disposal. We all have experienced these states, and we can, in one way or another, we can induce them. And it may not be easy to do in the beginning. It may be difficult to sustain them in the beginning, because that is just a little shallow dip, and the channels leading to it are likewise maybe so shallow they're almost indistinguishable. But we can find our way there. The more often we find our way there, and the more deeply we can experience those states, then the more accessible they become and the more stable they become. You follow my whole systems analogy in this?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So because we have experienced similar states in the past, we can sort of like an actor using emotional memory.
Yes, yes,
Sort of
yeah.
bring up that previous experience.
Right.
Interesting that you say that one should actually try and actively cultivate this. I've read other views of metta where people have said, well, you don't even need to try to develop these states. Simply say the phrases with the intention that they have an effect, or something to that effect. What would be your response to that
Well,
approach?
What you're doing there, and you can relate this to a lot of things that I say about meditation practices, other meditation practices as well, is all you can really do is form the intention for something, and then wait for mechanisms that you have no direct control over to try to fulfill that intention. Now, if you do nothing but hold the intention, then I would imagine that what's going on in your unconscious mind is going to be exactly what I have described. Parts of your unconscious mind are going to try to respond to that intention by recollecting it, by imagining or remembering situations that give rise to that. I'm just making it into an intentional, not only an intentional, but a conscious activity. So that's all. And my hope would be that by doing so, by deliberately recollecting, doing recollections that induce that. I mean, it's still your unconscious mind. Consciousness does nothing, right? It's still your unconscious mind doing this, but your unconscious mind is being, information is being put up on the bulletin board of consciousness to help guide the different parts of the mind system to do this, rather than them figuring out these as ways to fulfill that consciously held intention. That would be how I see as the only real difference between these two. I would expect it would work more quickly in the way that I've suggested. I should mention too, we don't just develop these, we don't just induce these states. What we do with them then is really, really powerful. Now, just as you may have induced these states through remembering particular incidents or interactions with people or things like that that gave rise to them, thinking about somebody, thinking about real people, imagining them in your mind, picturing them in your mind, this is very powerful. Picturing things is in your mind. It is so powerful that athletes can improve their performance as much by picturing themselves doing something perfectly as they can by practicing the action over and over again. So imagining someone that you are directing these to, and imagining that that person is experiencing these mental states, is a very powerful reinforcement to the whole process. So in the practice that I've described, I learned a lot of other different ways of practicing metta along the way. The first way that I learned was chanting the Metta Sutta. But, and I have to say, that has a certain effectiveness to it. Because what we say, the other parts of our mind hear what we say. And if we chant the sutta, there are parts of our mind listening to that, listening to the sounds that we're making, interpreting them and responding to them. So in a sense, that's the reason that the chanting of the Metta Sutta, as at first glance, you'd say, how on earth is that ever going to produce real loving kindness? But that's how it does, is we listen to what we're saying. Parts of our mind listen to what we're saying and respond to it. And so even that worked. So I learned different ways, and then I developed my own way that took advantage of my understanding. And that's what you're going to get in that appendix in TMI. Hope you find all this helpful.
Yes, I do indeed. Thank you. I think that sort of helps unify the different theories on metta a little bit more. So just the final thing was, could you talk about, you said, it's an essential part of our practice. We would be making a serious mistake if we did not include metta. Could you expand a little bit on why that would be the case?
I'm sorry, I got distracted and I didn't hear the last part of what you said. Could you just repeat the last sentence?
Yes, so I would just like to hear your comments on why you think this is such a critical part of the practice, why someone who would just be doing anapana or other techniques, why that would be a mistaken approach.
Because anapana is developing mental faculties, and just by developing those mental faculties themselves can lead to realizations and change in perception that have these kinds of effects. But it's much better to have these states available to the mind that's training in anapana long before the training has reached the point where you're likely to have these realizations and have these shifts in perspective take place. Making these mental states available, I mean, when I say look for the joy, learn to recognize dissatisfaction for what it is, all of these other kinds of things. I'm doing this because there is a predisposition that we all have to self-criticize, to doubt, to blame, to feel discouraged, to focus on the negative, right? Yes, that's the simplest way to put it, is focus on the negative instead of the positive. If we start early on in the process cultivating these positive states of mind, they are going to serve us so well in so many ways, and so very many ways. One, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself, one of the ways that we come to realize the effectiveness of our meditation practice is when it's reflected back to us by other people and by events in our daily lives that show that, oh, this practice is making a difference. When the people close to you mention that you've changed in certain ways, or you're easier to get along with, or you're not as reactive, or whatever like that, that is positively reinforcing. This is another very valuable kind of training of the mind that fits in very closely with all of that. If, like, you don't have to wait until you become an arhat to develop loving kindness and compassion. Far better you start developing loving kindness and compassion when you're still just trying to develop a little bit of samadhi and a little bit of sati, because they're going to be conducive to the development of samadhi and sati. They're also going to be conducive to later on to insight and to awakening. So they have a valuable purpose all the way along.
It's very interesting that you say that one doesn't have to wait for these states to come up, but that anapana or whatever meditation could generate them anyway. And that has been my experience. That has been, now that I'm in the adept stages or skilled stages, that I have spontaneous loving kindness states that have come up, but I've never tried to cultivate them consciously, but they have come up as a result of my TMI practice, my normal TMI practice. So it's nice to know that it's all in there. You can just help the process along, I suppose.
Wonderful. I'm glad that you realize that. Yeah, just learning to be happy that you've followed a whole breath cycle without your mind wandering, instead of being mad at yourself because you didn't succeed in following 2 breath cycles in a row without forgetting. That's an example of overcoming suffering and
finding joy, right?
Contentment and enjoyment. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah.
From the very beginning.
That does help. So it's because there are some people, especially I find Western people, who find the metta practice very difficult, and especially loving kindness towards ourselves is challenging sometimes.
It's
right?
the hardest one of all.
Right.
So
it was a wonderful experience for me when I started spontaneously having loving kindness moments. But now I feel like I'm ready to try developing them more consciously. So thank you very much. That helps me a lot. I love what you said there, learning to be happy, because I think it is something that can be learned and practiced. Right?
It is. It is. Yeah. And all of these things are obviously interconnected. So learning to be happy means learning not to be unhappy. It means learning to love. It means learning to experience sympathetic joy. It means learning not to be at the mercy of your cravings. It means all of this stuff. Anyway, we've gone a couple of hours, and my head's kind of saying, yeah, enough trying to convert my thoughts into words here for now. Sorry we missed the Q&A last month. We'll do better, promise. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you were able to make it in time, Juno, to bring up those wonderful topics. And so until next time, may you be well, especially in the current circumstances. May you be very well, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.